72 hours. That's what this punk told me I had to get out of my own cabin. I just sat there, staring, coffee cooling in my hand, wondering if I'd actually heard him right. A 17-year-old brat, live streaming from my dock, announcing to the world that my property was now his stage for a graduation party. And the kicker, his mother, the HOA president, stood there, nodding like this circus was perfectly normal. Are you kidding me? After 23 years dealing with criminals as a cop, I thought I'd seen every kind of entitlement. Turns out I was wrong. These two clowns were in a league of their own. But here's the thing I didn't blow up. I didn't yell. I stayed calm, let them think they were winning, and documented everything. Because when you've spent decades outsmarting people who thought they were untouchable, you learn patience. 3 weeks later, they found out exactly who they were messing with. 6 months ago, I thought I'd finally found peace. Pine Valley Estates, a quiet lakefront community about an hour outside the city. Perfect spot for a man who'd spent his career drowning in humanity's worst. I bought the cabin under an LLC, Lakeside Properties, because privacy isn't just nice to have when you've been police chief. It's survival. The neighbors thought I was some consultant. I didn't correct them. I just wanted to fish, drink coffee, and remember there was good left in the world. But that illusion shattered on a bright May morning. I was sitting on my dock, lying in the water, watching the sun turn the lake into gold when I heard them footsteps. Heavy, cocky, no hesitation. The kind that say, I own this place. I turned, and there he was. Kid couldn't have been more than 18. Designer. Clothes, $1,000 sneakers. Portable speaker, blaring. Behind him, 3 buddies filming on their phones, narrating like they were shooting some reality show. Yo, Steven, the kid barked. No hello, no excuse me, just straight to arrogance. He strutted right between me and the water, planted his feet, crossed his arms, and announced like he was delivering royal orders, I'm Dylan Thompson. My mum's the HOA president. Here's the deal, this cabin has been voted for community use. You've got 72 hours to clear out so I can throw my graduation party here. It's gonna be legendary. His friends whooped like he'd just dropped the winning touchdown. Phones kept rolling, capturing what they thought would be his big victory. I set my coffee down, slow and deliberate, buying myself time. In my career, I dealt with gang leaders, con artists, armed robbers. But there's something about spoiled rich kids with too much confidence and zero consequences that makes your blood run hotter than anything else. Excuse me, I asked, voice calm. This is my property. I own it. Dylan smirked and waved. His phone like it was holy scripture. Not anymore. My mum already handled the paperwork. Community youth access, or whatever. Point is you're out. I'm in. Parties in 3 weeks. End of story. That's when his mother showed up. Rebecca Thompson. If Dylan was entitled, Rebecca was entitlement with a law degree and 5 glasses of wine. She marched in like she owned the place, a fat folder of papers tucked under her arm, smiling with that kind of polished fake politeness that hides a knife. Mr. Thompson, she purred. I trust Dylan explained the situation. The HOA has designated your property for youth community access. It's all perfectly legal. She slid the folder across my table like she was handing down a royal decree. One glance and I smelled the rot. The letterhead looked official, sure, but the codes didn't exist. The meeting minutes, amateur fakes, the signatures, rushed and sloppy. 2 decades in law enforcement teaches you to spot fraud, and this wasn't even good fraud. but I didn't let on. I flipped the folder shut and said, "I'll need to review this with my attorney." For a split second, her smile cracked. Just for a breath. Then she pulled it back, colder this time, of course. But the timeline stands. 72 hours, Mr. Thompson. We wouldn't want things to get unpleasant. They strutted away, Dylan narrating to his followers like he'd already won. My instincts told me something loud and clear. This wasn't some neighborhood spat. Rebecca Thompson wasn't just drunk on power, she was dangerous. But she'd made a mistake. She thought I was some quiet pushover who'd back down. She had no idea I was Chief Stephen Thompson, 23 years in law enforcement. And I didn't roll over for anyone. That night, I did what I always do when someone hands me bad paperwork. I went straight to the county attorney's office. Not as Police Chief Thompson, just as Stephen, concerned citizen. I asked them to check the codes and initiatives Rebecca cited. 2 hours later, I had my answer. The codes didn't exist. The emergency powers were fiction. The entire thing was smoke and mirrors. Unfortunately for Rebecca, she'd picked the one guy in this community who could smell a fake from a mile away. I spent the rest of the weekend quietly upgrading my property security. Not the cheap Amazon cameras, the real deal surplus from a department upgrade. Hidden in trees, tucked under eaves, encrypted cloud backups. If they wanted to play, I'd record every move. By Monday morning, Rebecca showed up again, this time with backup. Dylan live streaming, 2 reluctant board members, and a slick lawyer who looked like he charged by the syllable. They demanded a mandatory property inspection. I blocked the doorway and asked for a warrant. Of course, they didn't have one. That's when Rebecca dropped the act completely. Her smile vanished. She leaned in and hissed, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Oh, I had an idea. And she was about to find out exactly who she was dealing with. That evening, my security cameras caught something interesting. Rebecca and her husband, a local developer, were walking around my property perimeter, pointing at things and taking notes, professional notes, not casual observations. They spent extra time examining my visible security cameras, with her husband taking photos and making sketches. I watched them through my hidden system, noting how they moved with the confidence of people conducting legitimate business rather than trespassing on private property. Standard residential setup, I heard him tell Rebecca. Cheap consumer cameras, basic DVR system, nothing we can't work around if needed. They had no idea they were being recorded by a complete lies professional grade surveillance network. Dylan's social media campaign was hitting full swing, too. Every day brought new posts about the selfish boomer blocking kids' graduation celebration, complete with sober stories about how hard he'd worked in high school and how he deserved this one perfect party. The comments were brutal, calling me everything from a community parasite to a youth-hating monster. Local teenagers were sharing his posts, and I started getting dirty looks at the grocery store from parents who dapperly decided I was the villain. In this story, the kid was good at playing victim. I'll give him that. Meanwhile, I was doing some investigation of my own. Property records showed that Rebecca's husband owned development permits for lakefront expansion projects, permits that were currently held up by environmental impact studies and community opposition, permits that would become much more valuable if a certain lakefront cabin suddenly became available for purchase at a distressed price. Suddenly, Dylan's party demand made a lot more sense. This wasn't about community youth access at all. This was about forcing me to sell so they could expand their development project. Ellie Wilson became my unofficial intelligence network. Rebecca called another emergency HOA meeting for Thursday. Shuttled me over coffee, but she scheduled it for 10 a.m. on a weekday when most people are working. And get this, she's accepting proxy votes from board members who can't attend. She could literally vote herself, whatever authority she wants. That's when I realized Rebecca was operating at a completely different level than your average neighborhood errant. She understood legal loopholes, procedural manipulation, and bureaucratic warfare. This was going to take more than patience and good documentation. Thursday's HOA meeting was a masterclass in manufactured authority. Rebecca had invited local press, positioned herself behind a podium like she was running City Hall, and a presentation complete with charts and graphs about community youth wellness initiatives. She'd even arranged for several teenagers to attend and speak about how much they'd benefit from having access to lakefront property for educational and recreational purposes. It was political theater at its finest, designed to make anyone whoopist. Her look like they hated children and community spirit. When she called for the vote on official Idisgant, my property for youth access, I stood up. Point of order, I said, using my cop voice for the first time since this whole thing started. I'd like to see the specific county codes that authorized this action, as well as verification that proper notice was given to all affected property owners. The room went quiet. Rebecca's confident smile flickered. "Mr. Thompson," she said slowly, "this is an HOA matter, not county business." "Actually," I replied, pulling out my phone, "according to countercords, the codes you've cited don't exist. I have documentation from the county attorney's office confirming that no such emergency protocols have ever been authorized." The room erupted. Board members who had been nodding along suddenly looked confused and angry. Parents who had brought their teenagers started whispering urgently. Rebecca's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of red that probably indicated dangerous blood pressure levels. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "This matter will proceed as scheduled, with or without his scoopration." That's when I knew she was either completely delusional or had something else up her sleeve. So county officials listened to Stephen immediately while ignoring other residents. For months, what kind of consultant gets that level of respect from government lawyers? Dylan Thompson made his first real mistake on a Tuesday night, and thank God he was stupid enough to live stream it. I was in my kitchen making dinner when my security system pinged motion detected on the east side of my property. I pulled up the hidden camera feed on my phone and watched Dylan and two friends sneak around my shed like discount ninjas. They were wearing dark hoodies and had their faces partially covered, which would have been smart if they weren't broadcasting. Lived to thousands of followers while committing crimes. "What's up, squad?" Dylan whispered to his phone, apparently unaware that whispering doesn't matter when you're literally announcing your location and intentions to the internet. Operation Cabin Liberation is a go. This old dude thinks he can keep community property from the youth, but we're going to show him who really runs Pine Valley. His friends giggled like this was some kind of innocent prank instead of breaking and entering. I watched them try the shed door, find it locked, then produce a crowbar from somewhere. "Don't worry, guys." Dylan continued his narration. "My mum says possession is 9/10 of the law. Once we establish community use, he can't do anything about it." The kid proceeded to break into my shed, steal my father's vintage fishing equipment, and spray paint community property across the side while his friends cheered and his live stream audience watched in real time. What made it even better was listening to him explain his legal theory while committing felonies. See, Technically, this stuff belongs to the community now because of the Youth Access Initiative. I'm not stealing, I'm just redistributing resources. You cold practically hear the collective IQ drop of everyone watching this disaster unfold. But hey, teenage criminals document their own crimes saves law enforcement a lot of paperwork. I called the county sheriff's office, not as Chief Thompson, but as Stephen Thompson, victim of a crime in progress. Hi, I'm calling to report a break-in. The perpetrator is currently on my property, stealing items and broadcasting it live on social media. The dispatcher was professional, taking down details and promising units would respond within 15 minutes. I gave them Dylan's social media handle so they could watch the crime happening in real time. Sir, the dispatcher asked, are you in immediate danger? Do you need to stay on the line? No, I told her. I'm secure inside my house. But you might want to hurry because this kid is creating a lot of evidence against himself right now. Rebecca showed up just as the sheriff's deputies arrived, which told me everything I needed to know about who was really orchestrating this operation. She came screeching into my driveway in her BMW, jumped out like she was storming the beaches of Normandy, and immediately started yelling at the deputies. Officers, this man is harassing my son. Dylan was just retrieving community property under the authorized youth access program. The deputies, both young guys who probably dealt with entitled parents, regularly looked at each other with that special expression cops get when civilians try to explain why crimes aren't really crimes. Ma'am, the senior deputy said patiently, we have video evidence of your son breaking and entering, vandalizing property and theft. The fact that he broadcast it live to social media makes this pretty straightforward. Rebecca's face went through that interesting color engine grass again. You don't understand, and I'm the HOA president. This property has been designated for community use. My son has every right to access these facilities. The deputy glanced at me. Sir, is this your property? Yes, officer, I replied. I have deed and title documentation if needed. Ma'am, the deputy turned back to Rebecca. Our rules don't override property law or criminal statutes. Your son committed multiple crimes tonight. Dylan, meanwhile, was having his own meltdown. The reality of actual consequences was apparently a new experience for him. This is so unfair, he wailed as they cuffed him. My mum said everything was legal. She said the community voted. You can't arrest me for taking community property. The deputies were remarkably patient, explaining that breaking and entering is still breaking and entering, regardless of whatever fantasy legal theory his mother had fed him. His phone, still live streaming, captured every moment of his arrest, including the exact second when teenage invincibility met adult reality. But Rebecca wasn't done. As the deputies loaded Dylan into their car, she turned her attention to me with pure rage in her eyes. You think you've won something, she hissed, getting close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with desperation. You have no idea what you've started. Know people in this county. I know judges, city council members, developers. I can make your life very, very difficult. It was a threat, clear and simple, delivered by someone who had apparentless intimidation successfully before. Too bad she had no idea. She was threatening someone who'd spent 2 decades dealing with much scarier people than suburban HOA presidents. The next morning brought a parade of official harassment. First, the city building inspector showed up, claiming there had been anonymous complaints about unpermitted modifications to my property. Then the environmental complaint officer investigating. reports of improper waste disposal. Then the fire department responding to concerns about blocked emergency access routes. Every single visit was polite, professional, and completely bogus. My property was up to code, had been inspected when I bought it, and was maintained better than most. But Rebecca was flexing her network, showing me what she could do with a few phone calls to the right people. That's when Ellie Wilson proved she was worth her weight in gold. She'd been watching from her kitchen window and came over after separative officials left. "Stephen," she said, "I've been Rebecca's target before. This is her standard playbook. First the legal intimidation, then the bureaucratic harassment, then the social isolation campaign. She's going to turn the whole neighborhood against you if she can." Ellie paused, studying my face. "But there's something different at Butu. Most people fold after the first round of official visits. You're not even stressed. What exactly did you do before you retired?" I almost told her right then. Ellie was sharp, trustworthy, and clearly on my side. But maintaining operational security was 23 years of habit, and I wasn't ready to blow my cover yet. "I worked in security consulting," I said, which was technically true if you considered public safety a form of security consulting. "Dealt with difficult people before." Ellie nodded slowly, but I could see her putting pieces together behind her eyes. Retired teacher instincts are almost as good as cop instincts for reading people. Dylan made bail the next day, courtesy of daddies. Money and an expensive lawyer who specialized in getting rich kids out of trouble. But damage was done. His live stream of the break-in had gone viral, not in the way he'd hoped, but as an example of fentanyl youth criminality. The comments were brutal, calling him everything from a spoiled brat to a future inmate. His count was dropping by the thousands as people realized they'd been watching someone commit actual crimes. For a kid whose entire identity was built around social media fame, watching his reputation implode in real time was probably worse than jail. Rebecca, meanwhile, was doubling down on her intimidation campaign. More official visits, more anonymous complaints, more bureaucratic harassment designed to exhaust my patience and resources. Shahad, no way of knowing that I dealt with organized crime figures who could teach her lessons about intimidation or thatha. Amateur hour psychological warfare was actually kind of refreshing compared to real threats. But her mistake was every move she made created more documentation, more evidence, and more witnesses to her abuse of power. Everyone's asking the same question. How does a retired consultant stay so calm while being criminally targeted? And why do the sheriff deputies seem to defer to his suggestions? We've all seen entitled kids think they're untouchable. Drop a comment sharing the wildest entitled behavior you've witnessed. But here's what I'm really curious about. What do you think Stephen's real background is? The clues are all there. By week 3 of Rebecca's campaign, the internet was buzzing with theories about my mysterious background. I'd catch groups of neighbors stopping their conversations when I walked by, then resuming in hushed whispers once they thought I was out of earshot. Ellie Wilson had become the unofficial intelligence coordinator, collecting observations and sharing them over coffee, like we were running some kind of suburban spy network. Mrs. Patterson noticed, "You never lock your doors when you go out," she reported, "and the mailman says, you get government correspondence that looks official, but isn't from the usual agencies." I had to admire their detective work, even if they were completely missing the obvious sensor. The breakthrough came when Rebecca hired a private investigator. I spotted the surveillance within hours, after 2 decades in law enforcement. You develop a sixth sense for being watched. This guy was good, though, better than most pies I'd encountered. Professional equipment, careful positioning, patient. Enough to spend entire days documenting my routine without getting obvious about it. He photographed my property, ran my license plates, probably checked public records and financial databases. I almost respected the thoroughness, right up until I realized how spectacularly he was missing the most important clues. Dylan was back to his social media campaign, but with a new edge of desperation. His follower count had stabilized after the massive drop from his arrest, but the engagement was different now. Instead of adoring fans hanging on his every word, the comments were full of people telling him to grow up, get a job, or face reality. "You guys don't understand," he pleaded in one live stream I watched while eating breakfast. "This isn't about me wanting free stuff. This is about community rights. My mum has been fighting for youth access to recreational facilities for years." The kid actually believed his own propaganda, which would have been sad if he weren't such an entitled little criminal. Rebecca's husband, the developer, showed up at my property again, this time with what looked like surveying equipment. I watched through me hidden cameras as he took measurements, photographed sightlines, and made detailed notes about my property's layout. But what caught my attention was his phone call afterward. The structure's in perfect condition, he told someone, probably Rebecca. Minimal renovation needed for conversion to community space. Property values probably around $600,000, but we could force a distressed sale for half that if the pressure campaign works. So there it was, the real motive behind Dylan's party demand. They weren't just trying to humiliate me into leaving. They were planning to profit from it. That's when my old training kicked in fully. If Rebecca and her husband thought they were dealing with some retired suburbanite they could intimidate and manipulate, they were about to get a very expensive education. I started building a case against them, the way you'd build a case against any criminal enterprise. Financial records, requests, property searches, background investigation into their previous business dealings. What I found was a pattern of aggressive development projects that somehow always ended up displacing long-time residents who'd initially opposed them. Rebecca had just weaponized her HOA position. She'd turned it into a real estate acquisition tool. The private investigators' report landed on Rebecca's desk Friday afternoon. And I know this because Ellie Wilson's kitchen window had a perfect view of the Thompson house, and she'd noticed Rebecca reading something that made her smile for the first time in weeks. Whatever that investigator found, Ellie told me over our usual coffee. Rebecca thinks it's good news. She actually looked happy, which is terrifying because happy Rebecca is usually planning something awful for someone. I almost felt bad about what was coming. Almost Dylan's graduation party planning went into overdrive. Suddenly, social media was full of posts about the epic lakefront celebration that was definitely happening at my cabin with or without my permission. Location secured, he announced to his remaining followers. Community access approved. It's going to be the graduation party of the century. Had apparently interpreted his mother's good mood as confirmation that their intimidation campaign had worked. Thepper Kid had no idea he was about to become the poster child for consequences. The community was choosing sides more openly now. Rebecca had organized her supporters, mostly newer residents who were afraid of crossing her into what she called the Community Wellness Coalition. They held meetings at her house, strategized about troublesome residents, and generally acted like they were planning the Day invasion instead of harassing their neighbor. On the other side, Ellie had quietly assembled what she called the Reasonable People Society. Longtime residents, who was sick of Rebecca's tyranny, but had never found the courage to organize against her. What neither side knew was that I'd been having very interesting conversations with county officials, not as Stephen Thompson property owner, but in my professional capacity. We've got a situation developing in Pine Valley, I told the county attorney during one of our regular coordination meetings. HOA president appears to be using fraudulent accusation to justify harassment of residents. Might want to keep an eye on this one. Professional courtesy between law enforcement agencies meant they'd take my concerns seriously. Even if I couldn't directly intervene in my own case, Rebecca's confidence grew daily. She'd wave at me from her driveway with the smug satisfaction of someone woothed she'd won. Dylan was back to his entitled swagger, talking about his graduation party like it was already happening on my property. T-minus 72 hours, boomers, he announced in one Averium. Hope old Stevens got his moving boxes ready because the youth are taking over. His remaining followers were eating it up, convinced they were about to witness some kind of social justice victory instead of a criminal conspiracy. But the most interesting development was watching my neighbor's detective work evolve. Ellie's group had moved beyond casual observation to serious investigation. They'd noticed that I never seemed stressed. By Rebecca's harassment campaign, the official visitors treated me with unusual respect. I asked very specific questions about legal procedures and evidence documentation. Stephen Ellie said, during one of our coffee sessions, I spent 30 years teaching high school. I know how to spot someone with authority, and you've got it in spades. Military, government, corporate, security, because you were definitely not just some retired consultant. The night before Dylan's planned party, I got a call from my department. Chief, my deputy said, we've got intel about a large underage drinking party planned for tomorrow night. Live-streamed criminal activity, property destruction, the works. Thought you should know, since it's in your neighborhood. I thanked him for the heads up and assured him the situation was under control. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been documenting every aspect of this conspiracy for weeks, building a case that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. Rebecca made her final mistake, fate vening. She called me directly, voice dripping with fake sympathy. Stephen, she purred, I hope you understand that a morose celebration isn't personal. The community has spoken, and sometimes we have to accept decisions we don't like. I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to relocate. The call was being recorded, of course, as was her admission that this was all about forcing me to move. The criminal conspiracy, documented in her own words, was delivered directly to a police chief who'd been building a case against her for 3 weeks. But what if the private investigator missed something crucial about Stephen? Something that would make Rebecca's confidence the biggest mistake of her life. Graduation day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for what Dylan kept calling his legendary La Front takeover party. I watched from my kitchen window as cars started arriving around noon. Teenagers pulling out with cooler speakers and enough alcohol to float a small boat. Dylan was in his element, directing traffic like some kind of party general, live streaming every moment for his audience of remaining followers who were about to witness the biggest mistake of his young life. By 2 p.m., my property was completely overrun. I counted at least 90 kids, maybe more, spreading across my lawn like some kind of teenage invasion force. They'd brought DJ equipment that was blasting music loud enough to rattle windows 3 houses down. Coolers full of beer were being passed around openly because apparently underage drinking laws don't apply when you're claiming community property. Dylan was in heaven, phone constantly in hand, narrating history over the selfish boomer who tried to block youth access. If only he knew who was watching every moment through hidden cameras that would make his live stream look like amateur. Rebecca made her grand entrance around 3:00 p.m., arriving with a local news crew she'd apparently convinced to cover what she was calling a community celebration of youth empowerment. She dressed for the occasion in what I can only describe as her "I'm definitely not a Karen" outfit, complete with a Community First t-shirt that probably costs more than most people's monthly groceries. "Today represents a victory for common sense," she announced to the reporter, gesturing toward the chaos on my property like it was some kind of peaceful demonstration instead of a criminal conspiracy. When selfish individuals try to deny community resources to our children, sometimes we have to take collective action. The best part was watching Dylan Atmat to disable my visible security cameras. He'd bought some kind of signal jamming equipment online and was absolutely convinced he was outsmarting me. "Check this out, everyone," he announced to his livestream audience, holding up what looked like a router with extra antennas. Old man thought his cheap cameras would stop us. Boo technology always wins. He activated his jammer, watched my decoy, cameras go offline, then did a little victory dance while declaring himself the master of tech warfare. What he didn't know was that his celebration was being recorded in 4K. Resolution by a completely separate system he'd never even suspected existed. The property destruction started around 4:00 p.m. once the kids were sufficiently drunk. To think vandalism was hilarious. They spray-painted Youth Zone across my shed, trampled my garden, and threw beer bottles into the lake while Dylan cheered them on like some kind of destructive cheerleader. "This is Witherpans when boomers try to hoard community resources," he declared, apparently unaware that he was providing a running commentary for what would become excellent evidence in his upcoming criminal trial. The youth will not be denied. Rebecca was working the crowd like a politician at a campaign rally, giving interviews to the news crew about progressive community resource allocation and intergenerational cooperation through shared space utilization. She'd created an entire vocabulary of bureaucratic nanuness to disguise the fact that she was watching her son orchestrate the systematic destruction of private property. "Sometimes," she told the reporter with practiced sincerity, "community leaders have to make difficult decisions about resource distribution. Not everyone understands the bigger picture." Around 5 p.m., things took a darker turn. Some of the older kids started breaking into my cabin itself, live streaming their exploration of what they kept calling the new community center. They rifled through my belongings, posed for pictures on my furniture, and generally treated my home like their personal playground. Dylan was practically vibrating with excitement, phone camera capturing every moment of what he thought was his greatest triumph. "This is it, everyone," he announced. "We've officially liberated the lakefront fourth. People, no more selfish hoe-arting by bitter old men." That's when Ellie Wilson called me. "Stephen," she said urgently, "you need to see what's happening at Rebecca's house. She's got some kind of war room set up in her living room with charts and graphs, and what looks like financial projections. This isn't just about Dylan's party anymore." I thanked her and added this information to the comprehensive file-I'd been building. Rebecca wasn't just enabling her son's criminality, she was treating it as a business investment. The property acquisition angle was becoming clearer by the hour. The sheriff's department had been conducting what they call enhanced patrol of the area all day, which is law enforcement speak for, "We know something's about to happen, and we're ready for it." My hidden cameras had captured several patrol cars doing slow drives past the property, noting the underage drinking property, destruction, and general chaos. They were building their own case independent of mine, which would make the eventual arrests much cleaner from a legal standpoint. Dylan's live stream audience was growing as word spread about the epic property takeover party happening right now. Comments were flooding in, some supportive, but many horrified by what they were seeing. "Dude, you're literally committing Camera," one viewer wrote. "This isn't activism. It's just vandalism." But Dylan was too high on his own perceived victory to pay attention to the growing chorus of criticism. He'd created his own echo chamber of enablers and was completely convinced that he was some kind of social justice warrior instead of a spoiled criminal. By 6 p.m., the property damage was extensive. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, trampled landscaping, and trash everywhere. My father's fishing dock, where I had spent countless peaceful mornings, was covered in beer bottle sand, decorated with spray paint that declared it community property. Now, the irony wasn't lost on me that these kids were destroying the very thing they claimed to want access to. But that is the thing about entitlement. It's ultimately self-destructive. Rebecca was giving her final interview with the news crew when the first patrol cars arrived. I watched through my cameras as her confident expression shifted to confusion, then concern, then outright panic as more units appeared. "Officers," she called out, switching from celebration mode to victim mode in record time. "Thank goodness you're here. This gentleman has been harassing Gore. Community celebration." She pointed at my cabin like I was some kind of dangerous criminal, instead of a property owner whose rights had been systematically violated for 3 weeks. The senior deputy, a guy I'd worked with on several multi-jurisdictional cases, approached the news crew first. "Ma'am," he told the reporter, "I'm going to need you to step back while we process this scene. This is now an active criminal investigation." The reporter's eyes lit up because community celebration had just become criminal investigation. And that was much better television than Rebecca's carefully scripted narrative about youth empowerment. Dylan's live stream captured the exact moment when reality hit him. "Wait," he said to his phone voice, suddenly uncertain. "Why are there so many cops here? We're just having a community party." But the deputies were already moving systematically, documenting the property damage, collecting evidence, and identifying the numerous minors who were about to learn about consequences in the most educational way possible. Dylan's voice cracked as he asked his live stream audience, "Guys, what do I do? This wasn't supposed to happen." After all this chaos, Stephen still has shriveled who he really is. So, what happens tomorrow when he has to testify in court and they read his full name and occupation out loud? This is the moment we've all been waiting for. The entitled brat is finally facing consequences. Booty, need to know, what's your prediction for Stephen's real job? Military, government, corporate security? The truth is about to come out, and trust me, it's going to be worth the wait. Drop your guesses below because tomorrow's revelation will blow your mind. Monday morning at the county courthouse was like something out of a movie. And I mean that in the best possible way. The arraignment hearing for Dylan Thompson and 23 co-defendant Shod drawn a crowd that included half the Pine Valley community, 3 local news crews, and enough parents to fill a high school auditorium. Rebecca sat in the front row, wearing what I can only describe as her innocent victim outfit, complete with tissues and the kind of controlled expressions that screamed. My expensive lawyer coached me on courtroom behavior. Dylan looked like he hadn't slept in days, which he probably hadn't, considering his social media accounts had been suspended and his arrest videos were going viral for all the wrong reasons. His confidence swagger was completely gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone who was just beginning to understand that actions have consequences. The expensive lawyer his parents had hired, the same Jeffrey Morrison who'd shown up at my door 3 weeks earlier, was frantically shuffling papers and whispering urgent instructions that Dylan kept nodding, towing out, really listening. Judge Patricia Riss was presiding, a nonsense woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation for handling juvenile cases with exactly the right mixture of firmness and education. She'd seen every type of Entito Tenaga, Pine Valley's wealthy families could produce, and had developed a particular talent for cutting through parental, enabling to get to the truth of what actually happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced as the court came to order, "we're here today for arraignment proceedings in the matter of multiple criminal charges stemming from what appears to have been a rather eventful graduation party. The charges were read aloud, and it was likely listening to a catalogue of teenage criminality: criminal trespass, vandalism, destruction of property, underage consumption of alcohol, conspiracy to commit property crimes, and something called criminal mischief in a degree that I'd never heard of, but sounded appropriately serious. Each charge was accompanied by theft rays captured on video evidence, which made it clear that Dylan's decision to live stream his crimes was going to haunt him for a very long time. "Your Honor," Attorney Morrison stood up, "my clients are all recent high school graduates with no prior criminal records." This was clearly a misunderstanding about community property rights fueled by poor communication from HOA leadership. We request that all charges be reduced to minor infractions with community service requirements. He sat down looking confident, like he just delivered the kind of legal argument that wins cases and impresses judges. The poor guy had an idea what was coming. Judge Hendricks consulted her notes, then looked up with the expression of someone who just read something particularly interesting. "Before we proceed with plea negotiations," she said, "I'd like to hear victim impact testimony." "The court calls Stephen Thompson." That was my cue to stand up, straighten my tie, and walk toward the witness stand like I'd done hundreds of times before in my professional capacity. The courtroom was completely silent, everyone waiting to hear what the mysterious neighbor had to say about Dylan's community celebration. I was halfway to the witness stand when the court clerk did her job and read my full identification for the record. The court recognizes Chief Stephen Thompson of the Pine Valley Police Department, she announced in the clear, professional voice that court clerks use to make sure everyone understands exactly what's happening. Chief Thompson will impact testimony regarding the criminal activities that occurred on his private property. The reaction weighs everything I'd hoped for and more. Dylan's mouth fell open like someone had physically disconnected his jaw from his skull. Rebecca made a sound that was part gasp, part scream, and part dynonimal. Attorney Morrison dropped his pen and looked like he was having a religious experience. Specifically thickened, where you realize you've been praying to the wrong God for 3 weeks. The assembled crowd of parents and neighbors erupted in whispers that quickly became a buzz that threatened to become actual shouting. "Holy shit," Dylan whispered, apparently forgetting that courtroom microphones pick up everything. "Holy _ he's a cop. He's _ police chief." His voice cracked on the last word, and I could see the exact moment when 3 weeks of confident criminality collapsed into the terrible understanding that he'd been live streaming felonies while targeting a law enforcement officer. "We're so fucked," he continued, still forgetting about the microphones. "Mum, we're so completely fucked." Judge Hendricks banged her gavel several times to restore order, but even she seemed amazed by the situation. "Mr. Thompson," she said to Dylan, "I'd remind you that this is a courtroom, and your language should reflect appropriate respect for these proceedings. Also, you are correct that your situation has become significantly more complicated." That got a few barely suppressed chuckles from Valerie, because even judges occasionally appreciate perfect comedic timing. Rebecca was having what could only be described as a complete psychological breakdown. "This is entrapment," she shouted, jumping to her feet like she was planning to physically fight the entire legal system. He never identified himself as he pretended to be a normal citizen. "This is prosecutorial misconduct." Attorney Morrison wavering to pull her back into her seat while frantically whispering what I assumed were urgent instructions about not making things worse by screaming at judges. "Ma'am," Judge Riss said with patience of someone who dealt with unhinged parents before. Chief Thompson was under no legal obligation to identify his profession to people who were trespassing on his private property and committing crimes. His status as a law enforcement officer doesn't change the fact that criminal activity occurred. It simply means that their perpetrators demonstrated particularly poor judgment in their choice of victim. I took the witness stand and was sworn in just like any other victim providing testimony in a criminal proceeding. The only difference was that I had spent 23 years on the other side of this process, which meant I knew exactly how to present evidence in a way that prosecutors could use effectively. "Your Honor," I began, "over a period of 3 weeks, the defendants engaged in systematic harassment, property destruction, and criminal conspiracy, much of which they documented themselves through social media broadcasts. The evidence presentation was thorough and devastating. Video footage of Dylan's break-in and theft, recorded admissions of criminal intent documentation, of property damage, and audio recordings of Rebecca's threats and intimidation attempts. Every piece of evidence was stamp-stamped, authenticated, and presented in the kind of methodical way that makes prosecutors happy and defense attorneys very, very sad." Dylan kept looking at his phone like he was expecting it to somehow transport him away from this courtroom and back to his consequence-free fantasy world. "The total property damage," I continued, "exceeds $15,000, not including the cost of security system upgrades necessitated by the defendant's repeated criminal activity. But the more serious issue is the systematic nature of this conspiracy to involve fraudulent documentation, abuse of HOA authority, and what appears to have been a planned scheme to force the sale of my property through criminal harassment." Rebecca tried to interrupt several times, but Attorney Morrison had apparently convinced her that shouting at judges was not an effective legal strategy. She settled for making the kind of faces that suggested she was experiencing severe gastrointestinal, while Dylan stared at me with the expression of someone who was finally understanding how completely he'd screwed up his own life. The courtroom was packed with neighbors who'd been watching this drama unfold for 3 weeks, and I could see them putting together pieces they'd been puzzling over. Ellie Wilson was in third row, nodding like someone who just had her suspicions confirmed in the most satisfying possible way. The local news crews were frantically taking notes and probably regretting that cameras weren't allowed in courtrooms, because this would have been rated gold. Judge Hendricks reviewed the evidence, consulted with the prosecutors, and then delivered what Ty can only describe as a perfect summary of justice about to be served. Based on the testimony and evidence presented, she announced, "It appears that the defendants engaged in a systematic criminal conspiracy against a law enforcement officer, documented their crimes through social media, and showed complete disregard for property rights, community standards, and basic human decency. Bail is set at $50,000 per defendant, with conditions including no social media use, no contact with the victim, and mandatory enrollment in community service programs focused on property rights education. Dylan started crying, not the fake tears of someone trying to manipulate sympathy, but the genuine sobs of someone who just watched their entire future collapse in real time. Rebecca was still making angry noises, but they'd evolved from outright screaming to the kind of bitter muttering that suggested she was slowly accepting reality. Attorney Morrison looked like he was calculating how much was going to charge for what had just become the most complicated case of his career. As I left the witness stand, I caught Dylan's eye one more time. The kid who had swaggered onto my property 3 weeks ago demanding my cabin for his graduation party was gone. In his place was a sobbing teenager who just learned that live streaming crimes against police officers isn't actually a viable life strategy. Sometimes the best lessons are the hardest ones. The truth is finally out. But how will this revelation change everything for Stephen, the community, and the millions of people about to discover this story? 6 months after Dylan Thompson learned the most expensive lesson of his life, I'm sitting on the same dock where this whole adventure began, drinking my morning coffee and watching the sunrise paint Pine Valley Lake in shades of gold and pink. The water is peaceful again. My property is restored, and the only sounds are birds singing and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. It's everything I moved here for, with fetid satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice really does prevail. Dylan's courtroom breakdown became an internet legend within hours of the hearing. Someone in the gallery had recorded the audio on their phone, Anby, that evening. Clips of his holy _he's a cop moment were spreading across every social media platform on Earth. The video quality wasn't great, but the audio was crystal clear, capturing every moment of his realization that he'd spent 3 weeks live streaming crimes against a police chief. Within a week, the clip had hit 50 million views and spawned countless memes, reaction videos, and social commentary about entitled Youth Meeting Real Consequences. Rebecca's meltdown became equally famous, though for different reasons. Her screaming about unrepentant prosecutorial misconduct was turned into auto-tuned remixes, comedy sketches, and educational videos about how the legal system actually works. Law professors started using her courtroom behavior as an example of what not to do when your criminal conspiracy falls apart. And she became the unwitting poster child for parents who enabled their children's worst impulses. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a woman woe had spent years documenting her neighbors. Minor infractions had been so thoroughly documented in her own moment of complete moral collapse. The legal consequences were swift and comprehensive. Dylan was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation, with the understanding that any violations would result in transfer to adult prison. His social media accounts remained permanently banned, his college prospects evaporated, and his future employment opportunities were severely limited by his criminal record. The kid woe had built his entire identity around online fame, discovered that internet infamy follows you everywhere, and that Chief versus Karen's son wasn't the kind of viral content that opens doors. Rebecca faced charges for conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of her HOA position, ultimately pleading guilty to avoid a trial that would have aired even more of her dirty laundry. She received 2 years of probation, substantial fines, and droits, permanently banned from holding any HOA office in the state. Her husband developed projects, came under intense scrutiny, revealing a pattern of questionable land acquisition tactics that resulted in several civil lawsuits and regulatory investigations. The power couple, who'd thought that they could intimidate their way to profit, learned that criminal conspiracies have a way of unraveling spectacularly. The community transforian was remarkable to witness. Ellie Wilson was elected HOA president by unanimous vote, implementing transparent governance practices that turned Pine Valley from a dictatorship into an actual community. Property values increased by 25% as word spread about the safest neighborhood in the county, where entitled behavior met swift consequences and law enforcement lived next door. The community that had been divided by fear and intimidation, Beckham, united by shared values and mutual respect. Pine Valley became something of a tourist destination for people interested in community governance and justice stories. Reporters visited regularly to interview residents about life after Rebecca's reign of terror, and several documentary filmmakers explored using our story as an example of how communities can resist authoritarian behavior. Ellie started consulting with other neighborhoods with HOA abuse, sharing strategies for organizing resistance, and demanding accountability from community leaders. My professional life was enhanced by the experience as well. The case became a training example for policemen across the country, illustrating the importance of ethical conduct, community relations, and patient investigation, even when you're personally involved in a situation. It received commendations from the State Police Association and was invited to speak at conferences about community policing and professional restraint. Turns out that successfully handling your own victimization while maintaining profession's standards is rare enough to be noteworthy. The media attention was intense, but generally positive. Local news crews did follow-up stories every few months, tracking Dylan's progress in county jail. Spoiler alert, he was not adjusting well to a world where his name carried no special privileges. Rebecca's attempts to rebuild her reputation are sickless, and the community's ongoing recovery from 3 years of her authoritarian rule. National news picked up the story as an example of viral justice, with legal analysts praising the thoroughness of the evidence collection and the appropriateness of the sentences. Dylan's social media legacy became a cautionary tale used by teachers and law enforcement agencies to illustrate the dangers of documenting criminal activity online. His live-streamed confession and arrests were shown in schools across the country as part of digital citizenship, curriculating young people that the internet is forever and that poor decisions can have lifelong consequences. The kid Wode wanted to be famous for his epic graduation party became famous as an example of how not to live your life. Rebecca tried to reinvent herself as a boomed victim of an overzealous justice system, giving interviews to anyone who would listen about her persecution by corrupt law enforcement and vindictive neighbors. But her narrative never gained traction, partly because there was too much video evidence of her actual behavior, and partly because most people could recognize a narcissist trying to avoid responsibility when they saw one. She eventually moved to another state, where her reputation as the Pine Valley Karen followed her thanks to the magic of internet search engines. The property damage was fully repaired using restitution funds from the criminal sentences, plus additional compensation from Rebecca's husband's company as part of a civil settlement. My father's fishing dock was rebuilt exactly as I had been, and I added a small plaque that read, "Private property, trespassers will be prosecuted," with a sootertill that said, "Ask Dylan Thompson for details." It became something of a local landmark, with neighbors occasionally bringing visitors by to see the famous dock where the Pine Valley drama had unfolded. Ellie Wilson's leadership transformed the community in ways that went far beyond just replacing Rebecca. She instituted monthly community meetings where residents could voice concerns, implemented fair and transparent enforcement of Riazono Black community standards, and created neighborhood watch programs that actually focused on safety rather than petty harassment. The community that had been ruled by fear became characterized by cooperation and mutual support. My own life settled into the peaceful routine I'd originally sought when moving to Pine Valley. Morning coffee on the dock, fishing when the weather was good, and the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing you handled a difficult situation with professionalism and integrity. Neighbors were friendly but respectful of my privacy, understanding that the police chief who'd saved their community from a tyrant was also just a guy who wanted to enjoy his retirement property in peace. The story's educational impact extended far beyond Pine Valley. Law schools, you said the case, to teach about property rights, criminal conspiracy, and the importance of evidence documentation. Business schools examined Rebecca's abuse of organizational authority as a case study and leadership failure. Social media companies referenced Dylan's live-streamed crimes when updating their policies about illegal content and platform responsibility. Looking back on the whole experience, I'm struck by how predictable it all was once you understood the personalities involved. Rebecca was a classic authoritarian who'd never faced real consequences for her behavior. Dylan was an entitled teenager who'd been taught that rules didn't apply to him. And I was a law enforcement professional who'd spent decades learning patience and evidence collection. The outcome was inevitable. They decided to escalate beyond mere harassment into criminal conspiracy. The best part of the story's aftermath was watching genuine community spirit develop in Pine Valley. Without Rebecca's intimidation campaigns and arbitrary rule enforcement, neighbors started actually getting to know each other, helping with projects, and creating the kind of community that people moved to suburbs hoping to find. Property values rose not because of forced conformity, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a place where problems were solved through cooperation and mutual respect rather than fear and harassment. As I finish my morning coffee and prepare for another peaceful day in the community I help save from suburban tyranny, I'm reminded that sometimes the quiet neighbor really is the most dangerous one to mess with. Not because of any malicious intent, but because quiet people often have very good reasons for their confidence and patience. Combined with professional competence, can be absolutely devastating to those who mistake kindness for weakness. Dylan Thompson wanted a legendary graduation party that would make him internet famous. He got exactly what he asked for, just not in the way he expected. Sometimes the best justice is simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their own choices, especially when they're considerate enough to document those choices so thoroughly that prosecution becomes a matter of playing back their own confessions. Rebecca Thompson wanted to demonstrate her power over the community she'd terrorized for years. She succeeded in demonstrating something about power, though probably not the lesson she'd intended to teach. Real authority comes from serving others and earning respect, not from intimidation and manufactured crisis. The fake power she'd built through fear and manipulation evaporated the moment I'd encountered actual authority exercised with ethical restraint and professional competence. And me, I got exactly what I moved to Pine Valley for. Peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, if you are patient enough and careful enough, the good guys really do win in the end. That's how you handle entitled people who think they can take whatever they want. Asterisk, thanks for listening. See you in next one.